The morning sun cast long shadows through the crystal windows of the Imperial Palace as Emperor Zarthok made his way through the eastern wing. His massive form, standing nearly 12 feet tall with scales that shimmered like polished obsidian, moved with surprising grace through corridors designed for beings of his stature. The Draconian Empire had ruled the galaxy for over 3 millennia, and Zarthok was considered one of the most powerful emperors in their history. Today felt different, though he couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the way the light filtered through the atmospheric shields, or maybe the unusual silence that seemed to permeate the palace halls. The Emperor's enhanced senses picked up subtle changes in air currents and the faint scent of fear that lingered in unexpected places. As he rounded a corner leading to his private study, Zarthok nearly collided with a small figure carrying an ornate tea service. The collision was avoided by mere inches, but the servant stumbled backward, clearly startled by the sudden appearance of the massive dragon lord. "My deepest apologies, Your Imperial Majesty," the figure said, bowing so low that her face nearly touched the floor. "I did not hear your approach." Zarthok's golden eyes focused on the servant for the first time. She was human, one of the many species that served throughout the Empire, though humans were relatively rare in the palace proper. Most worked in the outer districts or on industrial worlds. This one was small even by human standards, perhaps reaching his chest if she stood straight. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style, and she wore the standard gray uniform of palace staff. "Rise," he commanded, his voice carrying the natural authority that came with centuries of rule. "You are not typically assigned to this wing." The human straightened slowly, keeping her eyes downcast as protocol demanded. "No, Your Majesty. I was asked to cover for Kethra, who fell ill this morning. I am Maya Chen, assigned to the servants' quarters kitchen staff." Something in her posture caught Zarthok's attention. She held herself carefully, as if movement caused discomfort. When she had bowed, he noticed a slight wince that she tried to hide. His predator's instincts, honed by evolution and enhanced by Imperial training, detected signs of injury. "Look at me," he ordered. Maya hesitated for a moment before slowly raising her eyes to meet his gaze. Zarthok was struck by the intelligence he saw there, a sharp awareness that seemed unusual for a kitchen servant. But more importantly, he noticed the careful way she held her head, the slight favor she gave her left side, and a barely visible discoloration along her jawline that cosmetics couldn't quite hide. "You are injured," he stated rather than asked. "I am well enough to serve Your Majesty," Maya replied quickly. "It will not affect my duties." The Emperor's tail swished once, a sign of growing interest that those who knew him would recognize as potentially dangerous. "That was not what I asked. You bear the marks of violence. Who struck you?" Maya's eyes darted away and Zarthok caught the scent of fear intensifying. But there was something else beneath it, something that surprised him. Defiance. This small human was afraid, but she was also angry. "I fell, Your Majesty. The corridors can be treacherous when one is tired." Zarthok had ruled long enough to recognize a lie when he heard one. His species had evolved as apex predators, and reading the intentions and emotions of other beings was second nature. This human had not fallen. Someone had struck her, and recently. "Show me your arms," he commanded. "Your Majesty, I assure you that is not necessary." It was not a request. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she set down the tea service and slowly rolled up the sleeves of her uniform. Zarthok's eyes narrowed as he took in the evidence before him. Dark bruises in the clear pattern of fingers wrapped around both her wrists. More bruising on her forearms, the kind that came from defensive wounds when someone tried to protect themselves. The Emperor felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Genuine rage not born of political necessity or territorial disputes, but pure, protective fury. In the Draconian Empire, servants were considered valuable resources. They were protected by law and imperial decree. More than that, harming those under the protection of the imperial household was considered a direct insult to the Emperor himself. "Who did this?" His voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper, and Maya couldn't suppress a small shiver at the sound. "Your Majesty, please, it's not important. I can still work." Zarthok stepped closer, his massive frame casting her in shadow. When he spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that could be felt as much as heard, a reminder that dragons were not merely large reptiles but beings of immense power. "I will ask once more. After that, I will simply have the palace guards question every being who has had contact with you in the past 3 days. That process will be considerably less pleasant for everyone involved. Maya stood silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with her decision. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Overseer Graktok, Your Majesty. He supervises the lower staff quarters. Zarthok knew the name. Graktok was a Corvani, one of the reptilian species that served in various administrative roles throughout the Empire. They were known for their efficiency and attention to detail, but also for their rigid adherence to hierarchy and occasional cruelty to those they deemed beneath them. What reason did he give for striking you? Maya's hands clenched into fists at her sides. He said I was insolent, that I needed to learn my place. And what did you do that he considered insolent? For the first time since their conversation began, Maya raised her eyes to meet his directly. The anger he had sensed earlier was now clearly visible, burning bright behind her dark eyes. I asked him to stop touching the younger servants inappropriately. I told him that even if we are human, we deserve basic dignity. The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop several degrees as Zarthok processed this information. The implications were serious enough to warrant immediate action, but there was something more here that intrigued him. This small human had stood up to a being twice her size and infinitely more powerful in the palace hierarchy, knowing full well what the consequences would be. You knew he would retaliate, Zarthok observed. Yes, Your Majesty. And you spoke anyway. Someone had to. Zarthok studied her for a long moment. In his 300 years of life, he had encountered countless beings from hundreds of species across the galaxy. He had seen courage born of desperation, defiance born of stupidity, and nobility born of breeding. But this was different. This human had chosen to act not for personal gain or survival, but for an abstract concept of justice, knowing it would bring her pain. Tell me about these younger servants. They are new to the palace, Your Majesty. Some are barely adults by human standards. They don't understand the way things work here yet. And you do? Maya nodded slowly. I've been here for 2 years. I know how to avoid most trouble, how to be invisible when necessary. They haven't learned yet. So you made yourself a target to protect them. I made myself heard, Your Majesty. Sometimes that's the same thing. Zarthok found himself genuinely impressed. The strategic mind that could assess a situation, weigh the costs and benefits, and choose principle over safety was not something he had expected to find among the kitchen staff. Moreover, the casual way she spoke of sacrifice for others suggested this was not an isolated incident, but part of her character. How long has this inappropriate behavior been occurring? Since the new staff arrived 6 weeks ago, Your Majesty. And you waited this long to act? Maya's jaw tightened. I tried other approaches first. I spoke to his supervisor, but Graktok told him I was lying to cause trouble. I tried to teach the others how to avoid being alone with him, but they're scared and confused. Some don't even speak standard well enough to understand the danger. The Emperor's claws unconsciously extended and retracted as he processed this information. The situation was worse than he had initially thought. This was not a simple case of a servant overstepping bounds, but a systematic abuse of power that had been allowed to continue for weeks. Why did you not bring this to the attention of the Imperial Guard? Maya looked at him as if he had asked why she didn't simply sprout wings and fly away. Your Majesty, I am a kitchen servant. The guard would never see me, let alone listen to complaints about an overseer. The request would never make it past the junior officers. Zarthok realized she was probably right. The Imperial bureaucracy was efficient but rigid, and complaints from low-level servants about their immediate supervisors were likely dismissed without investigation. It was a flaw in the system he had never considered before. Show me the rest of your injuries. Maya hesitated, then slowly turned to display her back. Even through the uniform fabric, the outline of bruises was visible. Zarthok's enhanced vision could detect the heat patterns that indicated recent trauma. Someone had struck her repeatedly and with significant force. This level of violence suggests he was not merely disciplining you for insolence. No, Your Majesty, I think I surprised him. He expected me to back down when he raised his voice. When I didn't, he became very angry. What exactly did you say to him? Maya straightened slightly, and Zarthok caught a glimpse of the steel beneath her quiet demeanor. I told him that even if he saw us as lesser beings, we were still beings, that we had value beyond what we could produce or provide, and that if he couldn't treat us with basic decency, perhaps he was the one who didn't belong in a position of authority. The sheer audacity of it took Zarthak aback. A human servant had essentially called a Corvani overseer unfit for his position, questioning not just his actions but his fundamental worth. In the rigid hierarchy of the Empire, it was tantamount to revolution. You understand that what you said could be construed as sedition. Yes, Your Majesty. Yet you said it anyway. Yes, Your Majesty. Why? Maya was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed too heavy for someone so young. Because someone has to speak for those who can't speak for themselves. Because if we don't stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous, then what are we? And because I'd rather be punished for doing what I believe is right than live safely while others suffer. Zarthak stared at her in amazement. This was not the mindset of a servant or even a soldier. This was the thinking of a leader, someone who understood that true strength came not from power over others, but from the willingness to sacrifice for principles larger than oneself. You realize that your actions have likely made the situation worse for the others. Graktok will now be more careful to avoid witnesses, but no less cruel. I know, Maya said quietly. That's why I was hoping to be transferred to another section, to draw his attention away from them. And you are willing to accept continued abuse yourself to protect others. If necessary. The Emperor felt something shift in his understanding of the small human before him. He had encountered heroes in battle, beings who faced death with courage and determination. But this was different. This was moral courage of the highest order, the willingness to sacrifice oneself not for glory or recognition, but for abstract principles and the welfare of others. How old are you? He asked suddenly. 24 standard years, Your Majesty. And how long have you been in service to the Empire? 2 years in the palace, 4 years total. I worked in the mining colonies before being selected for palace service. Zarthak's respect for her increased further. The mining colonies were harsh environments where only the strongest survived. The fact that she had not only survived, but been deemed worthy of palace service suggested capabilities far beyond what her current position indicated. What education do you possess? Maya looked puzzled by the question. I can read and write in Standard and 3 other languages. I have basic mathematical skills and some knowledge of xenobiology and comparative cultures. Nothing formal, just what I've learned on my own. Self-taught, yet clearly intelligent and articulate, Zarthak was beginning to understand that this human was far more than she appeared to be. Why were you selected for palace service? The recruiter said I had good organizational skills and could be trusted with sensitive tasks. Also, I think they needed someone who could communicate with the various species that work here. Zarthak nodded slowly. Palace servants were indeed chosen carefully, especially those allowed access to the inner sections. The fact that Maya had been selected suggested someone had recognized her potential, even if it hadn't been properly utilized. Tell me about the other servants who are being mistreated. Maya's expression grew protective. They're good people, Your Majesty. They work hard and want to serve well. They're just scared and confused. Most come from human worlds where they never encountered other species. Everything here is foreign to them. How many? 7 new arrivals, 3 males, 4 females. The youngest is barely 18 standard. Zarthak's tail lashed once, betraying his growing anger. The abuse of vulnerable individuals under Imperial protection was not just a violation of law but a personal affront to his authority. Has Graktok's behavior affected their work performance? Yes, Your Majesty. They're constantly nervous, afraid to be alone, reluctant to complete tasks that might put them in his path. Some have requested transfer to other duties, but he's blocked all requests. The picture Maya painted was one of systematic intimidation designed to isolate and control vulnerable individuals. It was exactly the kind of abuse that the Imperial protections were designed to prevent. And his superiors are unaware of this situation. I believe they choose not to be aware, Your Majesty. Graktok produces good efficiency reports and maintains order in his section. What happens behind closed doors is not their concern as long as it doesn't interfere with operations. Zarthak recognized the pattern. It was a failure of leadership that allowed competent subordinates to operate without proper oversight, as long as results were achieved. It was efficient but morally bankrupt. "What would you do if you were in my position?" he asked, genuinely curious about her answer. Maya looked startled by the question. "Your Majesty, I couldn't presume to advise you on matters of Imperial administration. I'm not asking for advice on Imperial policy. I'm asking what you would do if you had the power to address this situation." Maya considered the question seriously before answering. "I would ensure that the immediate abuse stopped and that the victims were safe. Then I would investigate to determine how widespread the problem might be and take steps to prevent it from happening again. And I would make sure that those responsible understood that this behavior was not acceptable under any circumstances." It was a thoughtful answer, demonstrating both strategic thinking and moral clarity. Zarthok found himself impressed once again by the depth of character this seemingly simple servant displayed. And if investigating revealed that the problem was more widespread than initially thought, then I would address it systematically, making sure that everyone understood that protection of the vulnerable was not optional, but a fundamental responsibility of leadership. Zarthok studied her carefully. "You speak of these concepts as if you have given them considerable thought." "I have, Your Majesty. When you're in a position where you see injustice regularly, you think about what you would do differently if you had the power to change things. And yet you chose to act even without that power. Sometimes acting without power is the only way to gain it." The wisdom in that statement struck Zarthok forcefully. This human understood something about leadership that many of his nobles had never grasped. That true authority came not from position, but from the willingness to take responsibility for others. "Tell me, Maya Chen, what do you think should happen to Graktok?" Maya's expression hardened slightly. "That is for Your Majesty to decide. I only hope that whatever happens, it sends a clear message that abuse of those under our protection will not be tolerated." "Our protection? Your protection, Your Majesty," I misspoke. But Zarthok noticed that she hadn't really misspoken. She genuinely thought of herself as part of a system responsible for protecting others, even though she held no formal authority. It was exactly the mindset he tried to instill in his officers and administrators, often without success. "No," he said slowly. "I think you spoke correctly the first time. The protection of those who serve the Empire is indeed our responsibility, shared by all who have any authority or capability to help." Maya looked up at him in surprise, and for a moment Zarthok saw hope flicker in her dark eyes. "Your Majesty is very kind. Kindness has nothing to do with it. It is simple justice, and apparently it has been lacking in my own palace." The weight of that admission settled between them. Here was the emperor of the most powerful civilization in known space, acknowledging that his system had failed those it was meant to protect. And the person who had brought this failure to light was a human kitchen servant who had risked everything to speak truth to power. "Will you come with me?" Zarthok asked. "I believe it is time I had a conversation with Overseer Graktok." Maya's eyes widened. "Your Majesty, surely that is not necessary, if you could simply ensure that the inappropriate behavior stops." "No," Zarthok said firmly. "What has happened here requires more than quiet correction. It requires justice, and justice must be seen to be done." As they walked through the corridors toward the servants' quarters, Zarthok found himself reassessing many of his assumptions about the beings who served in his palace. He had always thought of them as competent functionaries, necessary but largely interchangeable. The idea that among them might be individuals of exceptional character and capability had never seriously occurred to him. Maya walked slightly behind him as protocol demanded, but Zarthok noticed that her posture had changed. The careful, defensive stance was gone, replaced by something approaching confidence. She still moved carefully, clearly in pain from her injuries, but there was a sense of purpose in her step that hadn't been there before. "Tell me," he said as they walked, "what do you know of Imperial law regarding the treatment of servants?" "I know that we are supposed to be protected from abuse, and that we have the right to appeal unfair treatment, Your Majesty. I know that servants who perform well are supposed to have opportunities for advancement, and that discrimination based on species is officially prohibited." "You seem well informed for someone in your position." "I made it my business to learn, Your Majesty. Knowledge is one of the few forms of power available to those in my situation." Another demonstration of strategic thinking. Zarthok was becoming increasingly convinced that Maya Chen was wasted in the kitchen staff. Have you ever considered other forms of service to the Empire? Maya glanced at him curiously. I serve where I am assigned, Your Majesty. I have always assumed that my current position was the highest I could reasonably aspire to. Why? Because I am human, and humans rarely rise to positions of significant authority within the Imperial structure. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered without bitterness or accusation. But it made Zarthok uncomfortable because he knew it was largely true. The Empire claimed to be merit-based, but in practice, certain species were favored for leadership roles while others were relegated to support functions. Do you believe that is just? Maya considered the question carefully before answering. I think the Empire is vast and complex, and that managing it requires individuals who understand its workings and can command respect from multiple species. I also think that excluding potentially capable individuals based on their species of origin is inefficient and ultimately weakening to the whole system. It was a diplomatic answer, but one that contained a clear critique of current practices. Zarthok found himself wondering what other insights this remarkable human might have about the governance of his empire. They had reached the servants' quarters, and the change in atmosphere was immediately apparent. Where the main palace corridors were filled with purposeful activity and quiet efficiency, here there was a sense of tension and suppressed fear. Servants moved quickly and kept their eyes down, and conversations stopped whenever authority figures appeared. This is not how these areas usually feel, Zarthok observed. No, Your Majesty, it's gotten much worse in recent weeks. As they approached the administrative offices for the servants' quarters, Zarthok could hear raised voices from within. One was clearly Graktok's deep, harsh tones. The other was higher, more frightened. Please, Overseer, the frightened voice was saying. I was only trying to deliver the linens as requested. You were ordered to report at the 7th hour. It is now past the 8th. Explain your delay. I was helping in the kitchens, sir. They needed extra hands for the morning service. You will learn to prioritize your duties properly. Present your arms. Zarthok's eyes narrowed as he realized what was about to happen. He gestured for Maya to stay back and approach the office door. That will not be necessary, he announced as he entered. The scene that greeted him confirmed his worst suspicions. Graktok, a heavily built Corvani with the typical greenish scales and predatory features of his species, stood over a young human male who couldn't have been more than 19. The youth was backed against a wall, clearly terrified, while Graktok held what appeared to be a disciplinary rod. Both figures froze at the Emperor's appearance. Graktok immediately dropped the rod and fell to one knee, while the young human simply stared in shock. Your Imperial Majesty, Graktok said, his voice carefully controlled. I was not expecting your presence in this section. Clearly, Zarthok replied, his tone arctic. What disciplinary action were you about to take against this servant? Minor correction for tardiness, Your Majesty. Nothing that would impair his ability to work. Zarthok looked at the young human who was still pressed against the wall in terror. What is your name? T. Tom Harrison, Your Majesty, the youth stammered. How long have you been assigned to palace service? 5 weeks, Your Majesty. And is this your first offense? Tom glanced nervously at Graktok before answering. No, Your Majesty, I've been late twice before. I see, and what punishment did you receive for those previous infractions? Another nervous glance at the Overseer. Physical correction, Your Majesty. Zarthok felt his anger building. According to Imperial regulations, physical punishment for minor infractions like tardiness was specifically prohibited. Servants were to be counseled for first offenses and could only face disciplinary action after repeated violations and proper documentation. Show me your arms, Zarthok commanded. Tom looked confused but slowly rolled up his sleeves. The bruising was extensive and in various stages of healing, indicating multiple instances of violence over time. Overseer Graktok, Zarthok said slowly, would you care to explain why this servant bears marks of punishment that exceed anything authorized by Imperial regulations? Graktok's scales flushed darker, a sign of stress in his species. Your Majesty, the servant is clumsy and prone to accidents. The marks you see are likely from his work duties, not from any disciplinary action. I see, Tom, is that correct? Are these injuries from accidents during your work? The young man's eyes darted between the Emperor and his overseer, clearly torn between truth and fear. It's all right, Zarthok said gently. I want you to tell me the truth. You will not be punished for honesty. No, Your Majesty, Tom said quietly. They're from the punishment sessions. And what form do these punishment sessions take? The overseer uses the rod on our arms and sometimes our backs, Your Majesty. He says it's to help us remember our duties better. Zarthok's tail lashed dangerously as he turned his attention back to Graktok. Is this true? Your Majesty, maintaining discipline among the lower staff requires firm guidance. Humans are naturally unruly and respond only to clear consequences. I see, and who authorized you to use physical punishment for minor infractions? Graktok's flush deepened. Your Majesty, I was given discretionary authority to maintain order in my section. Discretionary authority does not include violation of Imperial law. Physical punishment of servants is specifically prohibited except in cases of violent insubordination, and then only after formal review. When was your last formal review conducted? Your Majesty, the servants under my supervision have never exhibited violent behavior. Then you admit that you have been using unauthorized punishment methods. Your Majesty, I was merely trying to maintain efficiency and order. You were abusing your authority and violating Imperial law, Zarthok said, his voice dropping to the dangerous rumble that preceded explosive anger. How many servants have you subjected to this unauthorized punishment? Graktok was now sweating visibly, the scent of fear rolling off him in waves. Your Majesty, I may have been overzealous in my methods, but my intentions were to serve the Empire. How many? Perhaps a dozen incidents over the past few weeks. Zarthok knew it was likely more than that. Abusers rarely admitted to the full extent of their crimes when first confronted. Summon all the servants under your supervision to this office, now. Your Majesty, surely that is not necessary. It was not a suggestion. Graktok hurried to comply, sending Tom to gather the others. Within minutes, a group of nervous humans had assembled in the outer area of the administrative office. Zarthok studied their faces and postures, seeing the telltale signs of ongoing trauma and fear. I want each of you to show me your arms, he commanded. The results were damning. Every servant bore marks of violence in various stages of healing. Some had clearly been struck more recently than others, but all showed evidence of systematic abuse. How many of you have reported these injuries to medical staff? Zarthok asked. None raised their hands. Why not? A young woman near the back spoke up hesitantly. We were told that seeking medical attention without permission would be considered malingering, Your Majesty. And who told you this? Overseer Graktok, Your Majesty. Another violation. Imperial servants had guaranteed access to medical care without requiring permission from their supervisors. Zarthok turned to find Maya standing quietly near the door, observing the proceedings with an expression of grim satisfaction. She had been right about everything. The abuse was systematic, ongoing, and completely unauthorized. Overseer Graktok, he said, his voice now deadly calm. You are relieved of your duties, effective immediately. You will surrender your authority badge and any administrative materials in your possession. Your Majesty, please, I can reform my methods. You will also submit to immediate arrest on charges of assault, abuse of authority, and violation of Imperial protective statutes. Graktok's face went pale beneath his scales. Your Majesty, surely we can resolve this matter without involving the criminal system. The matter will be resolved through proper legal channels. Your victims will receive full medical attention and compensation for their suffering, and you will face the consequences of your actions. As if summoned by his thoughts, two members of the Imperial Guard appeared in the doorway. Zarthok nodded to them, and they moved to take Graktok into custody. Wait, Graktok said desperately. Your Majesty, I can give you information about other irregularities in the servant administration, other overseers who may have similar management styles. Zarthok's eyes flashed dangerously. Are you suggesting that this abuse is more widespread than just your section? Your Majesty, I wouldn't want to cast aspersions on my colleagues without evidence. But you're willing to trade information about potential crimes in exchange for leniency. Graktok remained silent, clearly realizing he had said too much. Take him away, Zarthok ordered the guards, and begin a full investigation into all servant administration practices palace-wide. I want reports on every overseer, every disciplinary action taken in the past 6 months, and every injury reported by staff members. As the guards led Graktok away, Zarthok turned his attention to the group of frightened servants. All of you will report to the medical facility immediately for examination and treatment. You will also be reassigned to other duties while this matter is investigated. If anyone attempts to retaliate against you for your testimony today, you are to report it directly to the Imperial Guard. The servants looked stunned, as if they couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Tom, Zarthok said, addressing the young man who had been about to be punished when he arrived. I want you to understand something. What happened to you and the others was wrong. It was a violation of Imperial law and a betrayal of the trust placed in those who supervise you. It will not happen again. Thank you, Your Majesty, Tom said, his voice shaky with emotion. Don't thank me yet. Thank Maya Chen. She's the one who brought this situation to my attention. All eyes turned to Maya, who stood quietly near the door. Several of the younger servants looked at her with expressions of amazement and gratitude, clearly understanding for the first time who had been responsible for their rescue. Maya, Zarthok said, please remain. I have further matters to discuss with you. The rest of you go to medical immediately. As the servants filed out, many of them paused to whisper thanks to Maya. She accepted their gratitude with quiet dignity, but Zarthok could see the exhaustion in her posture. The confrontation had taken a toll on her, both physically and emotionally. When they were alone, Zarthok studied her carefully. Are you satisfied with the outcome? I'm grateful that the abuse will stop, Your Majesty. That's all I really hoped for. But, Maya hesitated. I'm concerned about what you said regarding other overseers, if this is a widespread problem. Then it will be addressed systematically, as you suggested earlier. I give you my word on that. Maya nodded, but Zarthok could see that something was still troubling her. What is it? Your Majesty, with respect, investigating and reforming the entire servant administration system will be a massive undertaking. It will require someone who understands both the current problems and potential solutions, someone who has the trust of the staff, and the ability to implement real changes. Yes, it will. Do you have someone in mind for such a position? Maya looked surprised. Your Majesty, I wouldn't presume to recommend personnel assignments at that level. But if you were to make such a recommendation, what qualities would you look for? Maya considered the question seriously. Someone who has worked within the system but isn't corrupted by it. Someone who understands the vulnerabilities of the staff and the pressures faced by supervisors. Someone who can communicate effectively with multiple species and has demonstrated both moral courage and administrative capability. An interesting job description. Do you think such a person could be found among the current palace staff? I don't know, Your Majesty. I'm not familiar with the qualifications and backgrounds of senior personnel. Zarthok smiled slightly. What if I told you that I believe I've already found such a person? Maya looked puzzled. I'm pleased to hear that, Your Majesty. The person I have in mind is standing in this room. Understanding dawned slowly in Maya's eyes, followed quickly by shock and disbelief. Your Majesty, you can't be serious. I'm a kitchen servant. I have no administrative experience, no formal authority, no. You have moral authority, which is more important than formal authority. You have demonstrated leadership capability under extremely difficult circumstances, and you clearly understand both the problems facing the system and the principles necessary to fix it. But Your Majesty, the other administrators would never accept orders from a human, especially one who used to work in the kitchens. Then they will learn to do so, or they will be replaced with individuals who can. Maya stared at him in amazement. You're offering me a position in the Imperial administration. I'm offering you the opportunity to build the kind of system you described earlier. A system that truly protects those who serve the Empire and ensures that authority is used responsibly. Maya was quiet for a long moment, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. Your Majesty, I'm honored by your confidence, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for such a position. Qualification is not the same as suitability. You've already proven your suitability. The qualifications can be learned. And if I fail, then you will fail honorably, having attempted something worthwhile. But I don't think you will fail, Maya Chen. I think you will succeed beyond your own expectations. Maya looked at him with an expression of wonder and growing determination. If I accept, what would my first priority be? Ensuring that what happened today never happens again. Building a system that identifies problems before they become crises and empowers staff at all levels to report concerns without fear of retaliation. It won't be easy, Your Majesty. There will be resistance from established administrators who see reform as criticism of their methods. I'm sure there will be, but remember, you won't be working alone. You'll have the full authority of the Imperial throne behind you and the knowledge that what you're doing serves the highest principles of the Empire. Maya straightened, and Zarthok could see the transformation beginning. The frightened kitchen servant was fatting, replaced by someone beginning to accept the weight and responsibility of real authority. I accept, Your Majesty. When do I begin? Immediately. Your first task is to oversee the investigation into current servant administration practices. Your second is to design a new system that prevents future abuse. Your third is to implement it empire-wide. And my fourth task? Zarthok smiled. Find and develop others like yourself. The Empire needs more leaders who understand that true strength comes from protecting those who serve, not exploiting them. As they left the servants' quarters together, Zarthok reflected on the morning's events. He had entered the day as the absolute ruler of a vast interstellar civilization, confident in his power and authority. He was ending it with the realization that his greatest authority came not from his ability to command, but from his willingness to listen and act on behalf of those who could not protect themselves. And he had learned it from a human kitchen servant who had risked everything to stand up for others. The galaxy, he thought, was full of surprises. 3 weeks had passed since Maya Chen's elevation to Inspector General of Servant Affairs, a newly created position that carried unprecedented authority within the Imperial administration. The transformation had been remarkable to witness, though not without its challenges. Zarthok observed Maya from his position at the head of the conference table as she presented her preliminary findings to the assembled department heads. Where once stood a frightened kitchen servant, now sat a composed administrator whose quiet authority commanded respect from beings twice her size and 10 times her former rank. The investigation has uncovered systematic problems across 17 different departments, Maya was saying, her voice clear and confident as she addressed the room full of senior officials. We've documented over 200 instances of unauthorized punishment, 47 cases of what can only be classified as assault, and evidence of a culture that has normalized the abuse of those in vulnerable positions. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Around the table sat the heads of various Imperial departments, most of whom had overseen the very systems Maya was now criticizing. Their expressions ranged from uncomfortable embarrassment to barely concealed hostility. Admiral Vexter, the Corvani head of military administration, was the first to speak. Inspector General Chen, while we appreciate your thoroughness, I must question whether a few isolated incidents warrant such sweeping accusations about Imperial culture. Maya turned to face him directly, and Zarthok noted the complete absence of intimidation in her demeanor. Admiral, when the same patterns of abuse appear across multiple departments, involving different species in supervisory roles and consistently targeting the most vulnerable staff members, we can no longer call them isolated incidents. They represent systematic failures that require systematic solutions. But surely, interjected Minister Corvan from the Financial Department, we must consider the challenges involved in managing such a diverse workforce. Different species have different disciplinary traditions. What might seem harsh to humans could be considered normal correction by others. It was exactly the kind of rationalization Zarthok had expected, and he was curious to see how Maya would handle it. Minister Corvan, Maya replied evenly, Imperial law is clear on this point. Disciplinary standards are not subject to cultural interpretation. When we allow different treatment based on the species of either the supervisor or the supervised, we create exactly the kind of environment that enables abuse. Are you suggesting that our cultural diversity is a weakness? Admiral Vexter demanded, his scales darkening with indignation. I'm suggesting that using cultural differences to justify treating certain individuals as less deserving of protection is not diversity. It's discrimination. The bluntness of her response sent a ripple of shock through the room. Even Zarthok was impressed by her willingness to confront senior officials directly. Furthermore, Maya continued, the investigation has revealed that abuse is not culturally distributed. We've found Corvani supervisors who treat all staff with respect and dignity, and human supervisors who have engaged in inappropriate behavior. The problem isn't species-based, it's systemic. She activated a holographic display that showed statistical breakdowns of the incidents they had uncovered. The data was damning in its clarity. What we see consistently is that abuse occurs in environments where supervision is minimal, accountability is weak, and power imbalances are extreme. When supervisors believe they can act without consequences, some choose to exploit that freedom. When staff believe they have no recourse for unfair treatment, they become vulnerable to exploitation. Director Morvac from the Engineering Corps leaned forward. Inspector General, while your analysis is interesting, what practical solutions do you propose? We cannot micromanage every interaction between supervisors and staff. Agreed, Maya said. Which is why the solution lies not in increased oversight but in structural changes that make abuse difficult and reporting easy. She manipulated the display to show her proposed reforms. Zarthok studied the presentation with growing admiration. Maya had clearly spent considerable time developing a comprehensive approach to the problems they had uncovered. First, we establish clear, uniform standards for disciplinary action that apply regardless of species. These standards will be codified in Imperial law and taught to all supervisory personnel. Second, we create multiple independent channels for reporting concerns, including anonymous options and advocates who can speak for those who are afraid to come forward themselves. Third, we implement regular rotation of staff between departments to prevent the development of isolated power structures where abuse can flourish undetected. Fourth, we establish mandatory training for all supervisory personnel on appropriate management techniques and the legal consequences of exceeding their authority. And finally, we create advancement opportunities that allow capable individuals to move up regardless of their species or origin, ensuring that supervisory positions attract those who are genuinely qualified rather than those who simply seek power over others. The room fell silent as the assembled officials absorbed the implications of her proposals. Zarthok could see the various reactions playing across their faces. Some looked thoughtful, others concerned, and a few clearly hostile. Inspector General, Admiral Vexter said carefully, these reforms would represent a significant change in how we manage personnel throughout the Empire. The costs alone would be minimal compared to the costs of continuing current practices, Maya interrupted. We're losing talented individuals to preventable turnover, spending resources on recruitment that could be saved through better retention, and damaging the Empire's reputation among species we're trying to integrate. More importantly, we're failing in our fundamental duty to protect those who serve us. Minister Corvan shifted uncomfortably. The reference to advancement opportunities concerns me. Are you suggesting that we lower standards to accommodate certain species? The question carried clear implications, and Zarthok saw Maya's jaw tighten slightly before she responded. I'm suggesting that we evaluate individuals based on their capabilities rather than their origins. The current system often promotes individuals to supervisory positions based on species affiliation or political connections rather than merit. If anything, my proposals would raise standards, not lower them. And what evidence do you have that the current system is inadequate? Director Morvac challenged. Maya looked directly at him. Yesterday, I interviewed a Corvani engineer with 15 years of experience who has been repeatedly passed over for promotion in favor of less qualified candidates. When I asked why, her supervisor explained that her species wasn't naturally suited for leadership roles. In the same department, I found a human with exceptional organizational skills relegated to menial tasks because he was considered too aggressive for advancement opportunities. She paused to let that sink in before continuing. Meanwhile, we have supervisors like the recently dismissed Graktok in positions of authority despite having no relevant training and a demonstrated inability to manage subordinates effectively. The current system doesn't promote the best candidates, it promotes the most connected ones. The accuracy of her observations was difficult to argue with, and Zarthok could see that even Maya's critics were beginning to acknowledge the validity of her points. But implementing these changes empire-wide would take years, protested Minister Korvan. The bureaucratic requirements alone. Which is why we start with pilot programs in select departments, Maya said smoothly. We test the reforms, refine them based on results, and then expand them systematically. We can begin implementation immediately in the departments where problems are most acute. Director Morvac looked skeptical. And who would oversee these pilot programs? Teams composed of representatives from each affected department, supervised by my office, but including input from all levels of the hierarchy. The people who will be living with these changes should have a voice in designing them. It was exactly the kind of collaborative approach that Zarthok had hoped Maya would propose. Rather than imposing reforms from above, she was advocating for a process that would build consensus and buy-in from those who would implement them. Inspector General Chen, Admiral Vexter said slowly, your proposals are comprehensive, but they assume that the problems you've identified represent failures of the system rather than failures of individual supervisors. What if the issue is simply that we need better screening of personnel rather than structural reform? Maya had clearly anticipated this objection. Admiral, individual failures occur within systems. When we see patterns of individual failures that consistently favor certain groups over others, and consistently emerge in environments with similar characteristics, we're looking at systemic problems that require systemic solutions. She manipulated the display again, showing correlation analyses that demonstrated the relationship between various environmental factors and the likelihood of abuse. Moreover, focusing solely on individual accountability without addressing the systems that enable bad behavior is ineffective. We can remove problem supervisors, but if we don't change the conditions that allowed them to become problems in the first place, we'll simply create more of them. Zarthok decided it was time to contribute to the discussion. Inspector General Chen, what resistance do you anticipate to these reforms, and how do you propose to address it? Maya turned to face him, and he saw a flicker of something that might have been gratitude for the supportive question. Your Majesty, I expect resistance from three primary sources. First, supervisors who have been using inappropriate methods and fear being held accountable for past actions. Second, administrators who believe that current problems can be solved through minor adjustments rather than structural change. And third, those who genuinely believe that certain species are inherently better suited for leadership or subordinate roles. And your approach to each group. For the first group, clear enforcement of new standards combined with training opportunities for those willing to reform their methods. For the second group, demonstrable evidence that structural changes produce better results than minor adjustments. For the third group, exposure to examples of excellence from individuals whose capabilities challenge their assumptions. You sound confident that such examples exist. I know they exist, Your Majesty. I've been interviewing staff throughout the palace for 3 weeks, and I've discovered remarkable individuals in positions that vastly underutilize their capabilities. We have a Zenthari linguist working as a cleaning technician who speaks 12 languages fluently and has developed innovative communication protocols for mixed-species teams. We have a human former military officer working in food service who has designed more efficient logistics systems in her spare time. We have a Korvani mathematician working manual labor who has solved complex scheduling problems that have frustrated our senior administrators for months. The revelation caused several department heads to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The implication was clear. Their current personnel practices were wasting valuable talent. These individuals haven't been promoted because they lack capability, Maya continued. They've been overlooked because the current system doesn't recognize capability when it appears in unexpected forms. Inspector General, Director Morvac said, his tone now more thoughtful than hostile. If what you're saying is accurate, the Empire is operating far below its potential efficiency. Exactly, Director. We're not just failing our ethical obligations, we're failing our practical ones as well. An empire that utilizes only a fraction of its available talent cannot compete effectively with civilizations that make better use of their resources. Zarthok was struck by the elegance of Maya's argument. By framing ethical reforms in terms of practical benefits, she was making it difficult for opponents to argue against her proposals without appearing to advocate for inefficiency. The question, Maya said, is whether we're willing to acknowledge these problems and take concrete steps to address them, or whether we prefer to maintain comfortable illusions about the effectiveness of current practices. The challenge was diplomatically phrased, but unmistakably direct. She was asking the assembled department heads to choose between easy denial and difficult reform. Minister Korvan broke the silence that followed. Inspector General Chen, assuming we move forward with your proposals, what timeline do you envision for implementation? The question represented a significant shift in the conversation, moving from whether to implement reforms to how to implement them. Phase 1 can begin immediately, Maya replied. Establishment of new reporting procedures, creation of training materials, and identification of pilot program sites. This phase should take approximately 6 weeks. Phase 2 involves implementation of pilot programs in 3 departments, with careful monitoring of results and adjustment of procedures based on feedback. This phase should run for 12 weeks. Phase 3 is evaluation of pilot program results and preparation for empire-wide implementation, which should take another 6 weeks. Phase 4 is full implementation across all Imperial facilities, which could take anywhere from 18 months to 3 years, depending on the size and complexity of individual sites. So we're looking at a 2 to 3 year process for complete transformation, Admiral Vexter observed. For complete transformation, yes, but we should see measurable improvements within the first few months of implementation. Zarthok leaned back in his chair, impressed by the thoroughness of Maya's planning. She had clearly thought through not just what needed to be done, but how to do it practically and effectively. Inspector General Chen, he said, you mentioned the need for advocate positions in your reporting structure. How do you envision those roles functioning? Advocates would be individuals specifically trained to assist staff members who need to report problems, but are afraid to do so directly. They would have the authority to investigate complaints, the protection necessary to pursue them without retaliation, and the communication skills needed to work with individuals from various species and backgrounds. And who would fill these positions? Maya hesitated for just a moment before responding. Ideally, individuals who have demonstrated both moral courage and an understanding of the challenges faced by vulnerable staff members. Experience with the current system would be valuable, but more important would be a commitment to the principles underlying the reforms. Zarthok understood the subtext. Maya was describing individuals like herself, people who had shown the willingness to stand up for others despite personal risk. Director Morvac, Zarthok said, turning his attention to the engineering chief. Your department was mentioned as one of the areas where talented individuals are underutilized. What is your response to Inspector General Chen's observations? Director Morvac shifted uncomfortably. Your Majesty, if there are qualified individuals in inappropriate positions within my department, I would certainly want to address that situation. And how would you go about identifying such individuals? I suppose I would need to review personnel files and conduct interviews to assess capabilities that might not be reflected in current assignments. Inspector General Chen, Zarthok said, would you be willing to assist Director Morvac in that assessment? Certainly, Your Majesty. I believe it would be valuable for all department heads to have accurate information about the capabilities of their staff members. There was a subtle emphasis on all that didn't escape anyone's attention. Maya was making it clear that the personnel review process should be comprehensive, not limited to a single department. Very well, Zarthok said. I want comprehensive personnel reviews conducted in all departments over the next 8 weeks, with Inspector General Chen's office providing guidance and oversight. Department heads will identify individuals whose current assignments do not match their capabilities and propose appropriate reassignments or advancement opportunities. The order was met with a mixture of resignation and nervous agreement from around the table. Zarthok could see that the prospect of having their personnel practices scrutinized was making his department heads distinctly uncomfortable. Furthermore, he continued, I want monthly progress reports on the implementation of Inspector General Chen's reforms, and I want to see measurable improvements in staff satisfaction and retention rates within 6 months. Your Majesty, Admiral Vexter said carefully, while we certainly support these goals, measuring improvements in areas like staff satisfaction can be subjective and difficult to quantify. Maya leaned forward. Admiral, we can use standardized survey instruments administered anonymously to track changes in staff perceptions over time. We can also measure objective indicators like turnover rates, sick leave usage, transfer requests, and productivity metrics. Improvement in treatment should correlate with improvement in all of these areas. You've researched measurement methodologies? Minister Corvon asked, sounding surprised. I've researched everything I could find on organizational management, personnel administration, and reform implementation, Maya replied matter-of-factly. When the Emperor gives you responsibility for empire-wide reform, you make sure you understand the subject thoroughly. The admission drew several surprised looks around the table. The idea that a former kitchen servant had spent 3 weeks educating herself on advanced administrative concepts clearly challenged their assumptions about her capabilities. Inspector General, Director Morvac said, what qualifications do you believe are necessary for the advocate positions you mentioned? The ability to communicate effectively with multiple species, demonstrated integrity and moral courage, understanding of imperial law and administrative procedures, and the emotional strength to deal with traumatic situations. Formal education would be valuable but not essential if an individual possessed the other qualities. And where would you find candidates with those qualifications? Maya's smile was slight but meaningful. Director, I suspect they're already working throughout the Imperial system, just not in positions where their capabilities are recognized or utilized. You're suggesting that we recruit advocates from the current staff population. I'm suggesting that we identify individuals who have already demonstrated the necessary qualities, regardless of their current positions, and provide them with the additional training they need to serve effectively as advocates. The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime indicating an urgent communication. Zarthok activated his personal comm unit and received a brief message that made his expression darken. Inspector General Chen, it appears your work has attracted attention beyond the palace. I've just received a complaint from the Corvani Trade Council regarding your investigation of their cultural practices. Maya's posture straightened, but her voice remained steady. What specific concerns have they raised, Your Majesty? They claim that your reforms constitute cultural discrimination, and that your focus on protecting weaker species undermines the natural order that has allowed the Empire to function effectively for centuries. The racist implications of the complaint were obvious, and Zarthok could see anger flicker in Maya's eyes before she brought it under control. Your Majesty, I would welcome the opportunity to address the Trade Council's concerns directly. I believe that protecting all Imperial subjects from abuse strengthens rather than weakens our social order. You're willing to defend your reforms before the Trade Council. I'm willing to defend the principle that strength comes from protecting those who serve us, not exploiting them. Admiral Vexter looked troubled. Inspector General, the Trade Council wields significant political influence. Antagonizing them could complicate implementation of your reforms. Maya turned to face him. Admiral, if we allow political pressure to dictate how we treat vulnerable individuals, then we're not implementing reforms. We're just rearranging the current system to make it more palatable to those who benefit from it. But surely some accommodation with their concerns would be prudent. What accommodation would you suggest? That we abuse staff members from some species but not others? That we apply protection selectively based on political considerations? That we acknowledge that some individuals are inherently less deserving of dignity and fair treatment? The questions were rhetorical but effective. Admiral Vexter fell silent, clearly unable to suggest specific accommodations that wouldn't compromise the fundamental principles underlying the reforms. Your Majesty, Maya said, turning back to Zarthok, I believe this complaint actually demonstrates why systemic reform is necessary. As long as we allow political influence to override legal protections, we create an environment where abuse can flourish under the guise of cultural tradition or natural hierarchy. Zarthok nodded slowly. You make a valid point, Inspector General. Very well, you will address the Trade Council next week. I'll be interested to see how they respond to your arguments. Thank you, Your Majesty. I look forward to the opportunity. As the meeting concluded and the department heads filed out, Zarthok gestured for Maya to remain. When they were alone, he studied her carefully. How are you feeling about the challenges ahead? Maya considered the question seriously before answering. Confident in the principles, concerned about the politics. The evidence supporting reform is overwhelming, but evidence doesn't always trump entrenched interests. And if the political pressure becomes too intense, then we'll know that we're threatening the right people, Maya said simply. Change is never comfortable for those who benefit from the status quo. Zarthok found himself impressed once again by her clarity of purpose. You've changed considerably since our first meeting. I've discovered capabilities I didn't know I possessed, Your Majesty. But the fundamental principles haven't changed. I still believe that protecting the vulnerable is a responsibility that comes with power, and that true strength is demonstrated by how we treat those who cannot defend themselves. Even when that puts you in conflict with powerful interests. Especially then. Zarthok smiled. I think the Trade Council is going to be very surprised by their meeting with you. I hope so, Your Majesty. It's time they learned that human weakness might be more formidable than they anticipated. As Maya left to continue her work, Zarthok reflected on the transformation he had witnessed. 3 weeks ago, she had been a frightened servant risking everything to protect others. Now, she was a confident administrator preparing to challenge the political establishment of the empire. But perhaps most remarkably, the fundamental courage and moral clarity that had originally attracted his attention remained unchanged. Maya had gained power and authority, but she hadn't lost the qualities that made her worthy of them. The empire, he realized, was about to discover what humans were truly capable of when given the opportunity to lead rather than merely serve. And he suspected that discovery would change everything. The great assembly hall of the Corvani Trade Council had never hosted a human speaker before. As Maya Chen walked through the massive doors, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space designed to accommodate beings 3 times her size, she could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Behind her walked Emperor Zarthok, his presence both supporting and amplifying the significance of the moment. The assembled council members represented the most powerful commercial interests in the empire, beings whose decisions affected the lives of trillions across hundreds of worlds. They sat in tiered galleries that rose toward a domed ceiling decorated with murals depicting the conquest and subjugation of lesser species. The symbolism was not lost on Maya. Council Speaker Vorthak, a massive Corvani whose scales had been polished to mirror brightness for the occasion, gestured toward the central platform with barely concealed disdain. Inspector General Chen, he intoned, his voice carrying the harmonics of authority and displeasure. The Council recognizes your appointment by His Imperial Majesty, though we question the wisdom of placing such significant authority in the hands of one so inexperienced in the complexities of interspecies governance. Maya stepped onto the speaking platform, her small human form dwarfed by the architecture around her, but her voice carried clearly through the hall's acoustic design. Council Speaker Vorthak, honored council members, I appear before you today not as an inexperienced individual seeking your approval, but as the Emperor's designated representative charged with reforming systems that have failed in their fundamental purpose. A ripple of surprise ran through the assembled council at the directness of her opening. Maya had chosen to confront their challenge immediately rather than attempting to deflect or minimize it. You have summoned me here to address your concerns about my reforms, she continued. But before we discuss your objections, I believe it's important to establish what those reforms are actually designed to accomplish. She activated a holographic display that showed statistical data from across the empire. The numbers painted a stark picture of inefficiency and waste. Over the past year, the empire has lost 47% more talented individuals to preventable turnover than in the previous year. Productivity in multi-species work environments has declined by 23%. Medical costs related to workplace injuries that should never have occurred have increased by 36%. And our ability to recruit qualified personnel from newly integrated worlds has dropped by 51%. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Maya had chosen to frame the discussion in terms the Trade Council would understand: economic efficiency and practical results. These are not abstract moral concerns, Maya continued. These are measurable failures that affect the empire's competitiveness and long-term stability. The reforms I have proposed are designed to address these practical problems by eliminating the systematic waste of human resources that has developed throughout our administrative systems. Council member Drachmer leaned forward, his voice carrying skeptical challenge. Inspector General, you speak of systematic waste, but what you call waste, we might call natural selection. Not all beings are equally capable of advancement, and pretending otherwise serves no one's interests. Maya had anticipated this argument, and her response was immediate and devastating. Council member Drachmer, I invite you to meet with technician Sithara, currently assigned to sanitation duties in the Eastern District. She has a mathematical gift that your finest analysts haven't recognized because she's Zenthari and works night shifts. Last month, she submitted an unsolicited proposal for optimizing shipping routes that could save your organization approximately 12 million credits annually. She manipulated the display to show the proposal's details. The proposal was dismissed without review because it came from a sanitation worker, natural selection, or systematic blindness. Or consider Engineer Corvan, a human assigned to basic maintenance because his supervisors believed humans lacked the spatial reasoning necessary for complex design work. He has independently solved 3 engineering problems that your best teams have struggled with for months. His solutions are currently being implemented unofficially by line workers who recognize their value, even though he has never received credit or advancement. The examples continued, each one more damning than the last. Maya had spent weeks documenting cases where the Empire's current practices had wasted exceptional talent due to prejudice and administrative blindness. The question, Maya said, is not whether all beings are equally capable. The question is whether we are capable of recognizing and utilizing the talents we already possess, or whether we prefer the comfort of assumptions that cost us billions of credits and immeasurable competitive advantage. Council Speaker Vorthak's scales had darkened to an angry bronze. Inspector General, your examples are carefully selected exceptions. They do not justify wholesale changes to systems that have served the Empire effectively for centuries. Council Speaker, Maya replied, her voice remaining calm despite the obvious hostility. What evidence would convince you that current practices are systematically ineffective? Evidence that the problems you describe are widespread rather than isolated, and evidence that your proposed solutions would actually improve rather than disrupt established procedures. Maya nodded and manipulated the display again. Very well. The investigation my office has conducted over the past 2 months examined personnel practices across 47 departments on 12 different worlds. We found consistent patterns of talent misallocation, systematic discrimination, and administrative practices that prioritize political connections over competence. The new data was comprehensive and undeniable. Maya had built her case methodically, documenting not just individual instances of abuse, but empire-wide patterns of inefficiency. Furthermore, the 3 pilot programs we have implemented show measurable improvements in all relevant metrics. Departments that have adopted the reformed practices show 18% higher productivity, 29% lower turnover, 42% fewer workplace injuries, and 63% higher staff satisfaction scores. Those improvements come at significant cost, objected Council Member Vector. Training programs, new administrative procedures, expanded oversight mechanisms. The expense is considerable. The cost of implementation is approximately 1/10 the current cost of turnover and replacement, Maya replied immediately. We're not adding expenses, we're replacing inefficient expenses with efficient ones. But more fundamentally, she continued, what price do we place on the Empire's moral authority? How do we justify asking newly integrated worlds to trust our governance when we allow systematic abuse of those under our protection? The question struck at the heart of the Empire's expansion strategy. Integration of new worlds required not just military conquest but cultural acceptance, and that acceptance was becoming increasingly difficult to achieve. Emperor Zarthok chose this moment to speak for the first time since the proceedings began. Council members, Inspector General Chen raises a crucial point. Our intelligence services report growing resistance to Imperial integration among target worlds, specifically citing concerns about how we treat our subject populations. The weight of the Emperor's intervention changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. This was no longer a debate about internal administrative procedures, but a discussion of Imperial strategy and survival. Your Majesty, Council Speaker Vorthak said carefully, surely external perceptions can be managed through improved communications rather than fundamental changes to our proven systems. Can they? Zarthak asked mildly. When our recruitment efforts on newly contacted human worlds consistently fail because word has spread about how humans are treated within existing Imperial structures. When qualified individuals from multiple species refuse Imperial service because they have heard about our workplace conditions. When allied civilizations express concerns about the moral foundation of our governance. Maya seized the opening the Emperor had provided. The Empire's strength has always come from its ability to integrate diverse populations effectively. When we waste the talents of those populations through prejudice and abuse, we undermine the very foundation of our success. Moreover, she continued, we face increasing competition from civilizations that make better use of their resources. The Altarian Federation has begun recruiting individuals who leave Imperial service due to poor treatment. The Centauri Alliance specifically targets talented beings from species we have marginalized. We are literally training our own competition. The strategic implications were obvious, and Maya could see that several council members were beginning to reconsider their positions. Inspector General, Council Member Drachmer said, his tone now more thoughtful than hostile. Assuming your analysis is correct, how do we implement these changes without destabilizing existing power structures? The question represented a significant shift in the conversation. Rather than opposing reform, Drachmer was asking how to manage it effectively. The key is gradual implementation with clear communication about goals and expectations, Maya replied. We're not removing legitimate authority, we're ensuring that authority is exercised responsibly and effectively. We're not eliminating hierarchy, we're making it merit-based rather than species-based. What safeguards do you propose to prevent these reforms from being undermined by resistant administrators? Maya had clearly anticipated this concern. Multiple independent oversight mechanisms, regular auditing of implementation, and advancement opportunities that reward effective implementation of reformed practices. We make supporting reform professionally advantageous while making resistance professionally costly. And what happens to supervisors who cannot or will not adapt to the new standards? They receive training and support to help them develop appropriate management skills. If they demonstrate willingness to learn and improve, they retain their positions. If they refuse to adapt or continue inappropriate behavior despite training and warning, they are removed from supervisory roles. You make it sound simple, observed Council Member Vector. The principles are simple, Maya agreed. The implementation is complex, which is why we're taking a systematic approach with careful monitoring and adjustment based on results. Council Speaker Vorthak shifted his massive form, scales reflecting his internal struggle. Inspector General, your arguments are persuasive, but they require us to acknowledge that practices we have defended and implemented for decades have been fundamentally flawed. That is difficult. It was the first admission of vulnerability any council member had made, and Maya recognized the importance of responding with respect rather than triumph. Council Speaker, acknowledging flaws in current practices does not negate the many successes of Imperial governance. The Empire has achieved remarkable feats of integration and administration. The question is whether we can build on those successes by addressing the areas where we have fallen short of our own standards. Moreover, she continued, the beings who will benefit most from these reforms are not external critics, but the millions of individuals who serve the Empire faithfully every day. They deserve to have their talents recognized and their service rewarded appropriately. Emperor Zarthak rose from his seat, his massive form commanding immediate attention. Council members, I believe Inspector General Chen has presented compelling evidence for the necessity of reform and practical plans for its implementation. The question before us now is not whether to proceed, but how to ensure that reform serves the Empire's long-term interests. The implicit message was clear. Reform was happening whether the council supported it or not. The only question was whether they would be partners in shaping it or obstacles to be overcome. Council Speaker Vorthak was silent for a long moment before responding. Your Majesty, if the Imperial throne is committed to these reforms, the Trade Council will provide whatever support is necessary for their successful implementation. It was a careful statement that acknowledged reality while maintaining dignity. Exactly the kind of diplomatic solution that allowed everyone to move forward without losing face. However, Vorthak continued, we request representation on the Oversight Committee that will guide implementation. Our members have extensive experience in personnel management across multiple worlds, and their expertise could be valuable in ensuring practical implementation. Maya nodded immediately. Council Speaker, that suggestion has considerable merit. The reforms will be most effective if they incorporate input from all stakeholders, including representatives from commerce, industry, and administration. Furthermore, she added, many of the most innovative solutions we have discovered have come from frontline supervisors and workers who understand the practical challenges better than any theoretical analysis could reveal. The Oversight Committee should include voices from all levels of the hierarchy. The proposal was diplomatically brilliant, giving the Trade Council a voice in reform implementation while ensuring that their input would be balanced by other perspectives. Emperor Zarthok smiled slightly. An excellent suggestion, Inspector General. Council Speaker Vorthak, I accept your offer of assistance and look forward to the Trade Council's contributions to this effort. As the formal proceedings concluded and the council members began filing out, Maya remained on the speaking platform, watching the beings who had initially viewed her with suspicion now discussing implementation details with genuine interest. Council member Drakmar approached her directly, his previous hostility replaced by curiosity. Inspector General Chen, may I ask what motivated you to undertake this reform effort? Surely there were safer paths to advancement within the Imperial system. Maya considered the question seriously before responding. Council member, I didn't seek advancement. I sought justice for individuals who were being harmed by systems that were supposed to protect them. The advancement came because someone recognized that moral courage might be a valuable qualification for administrative authority. And if you have,